So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what I think is the final panel discussion of the WISE conference this year on why does social and emotional learning matter. My name is Dominic Register. I'm a program director at Salzburg Global Seminar, which is an independent, not-for-profit strategic convening organization based in Salzburg in Austria. And through the work with Salzburg Global Seminar, I've also come to be very closely involved with a new global alliance around social and emotional learning and life skills called Karanga. And we'll be talking about Karanga more during the discussion because a number of my colleagues, in fact, almost all of them on the stage, are also involved in Karanga. And we're trying to rope Katie J in at some point soon. So it feels very much as if social and emotional learning is having a moment right now in global education reform discussions. It's certainly featured in almost every part of WISE that I've been involved in over the last couple of days. What we thought it would be useful to do is just set out at the very beginning what we're meaning by social and emotional learning for the purposes of this panel discussion and some of the reasons why we think it's so important. And what we'll then do is go into a short introduction from each of the expert panelists. We'll be using the WISE app to pose some questions to you to get your ideas about this at different points during the program. So please be ready to respond to the questions in that. And then we'll move to a discussion and we'll take about 50 minutes to an hour of the time and then we'll have questions from you at the end. So when we're talking about social and emotional learning, at its core, we're talking about people's ability to learn and manage their own emotions and interactions in ways that benefit themselves and others, and things that can help people succeed in schooling, in the workplace, throughout their education, with their relationships, and with the roles that they have to play as citizens. Now, that definition is from Stephanie Jones, who's a professor at the Easel Lab at Harvard, who's done an awful lot of work around building the ecosystem for social and emotional learning globally. And really, Stephanie's talking there about skills and competencies that can help you live with yourself, live with other people, and do good work along the way. I think what we're seeing increasingly, and this is, I think, why WISE wanted to have a panel on this topic, is that social and emotional learning is also a core part of the answer of what it means to be human. We are fundamentally social and emotional beings. And increasingly, in this age of AI and advanced automation, the skills and competencies that social and emotional learning programs can help people develop are the skills and competencies that won't be automated in the near future. So SEL understanding and SEL literacy and practice is going to be increasingly important for the economies of tomorrow and the workforce of tomorrow. Similarly, a lot of people, a lot of education change makers around the world are concerned about mental health crisis in adolescence. There is a growing body of evidence that shows how social and emotional skills and competence introduced at an early age can help young people grow up with the mental architecture to find their way around challenges like depression. The WHO have a shocking survey, a shocking report that says by 2030, depression will be the single largest cause of adolescent illness and disability globally. So the more that we can introduce SEL programs into our school systems now, the better young people will be equipped to deal with those kind of challenges. Similarly, social and emotional learning programs are really important for challenges around social cohesion and issues of identity as populations become more fluid. There's a growing body of research that shows how fundamental they are to realizing the Sustainable Development Goals and the kind of skills that populations will need to have in greater abundance than we currently do if we're to meet the challenges of the SDGs. And crucially for an education conference, SEL is also about academic attainment, and SEL supports and reinforces academic attainment, and there is strong evidence that shows that is particularly true for the most disadvantaged students around the world. Can see a reassuring number of nodding heads as I do that, so we're definitely all in the right room. Now, all of that, when we've talked about this work in Salzburg, we've tried to frame it through a sort of supply and demand analysis, and all of those arguments for it are on the demand side. What we've heard repeatedly is that there are a series of reasonably universal supply-side challenges that prevent education systems from making the pivot or adjustment towards SEL. And these are around teacher preparation and adult understanding of the terminology. These are around curriculum design and the recognition of extracurricular learning opportunities. And these are also around measurement and assessment of SEL. And through our discussions, we'll touch on all of these issues, I hope. So I'm going to very quickly introduce the panel now. Their bios are all available on the app, so we won't spend too much time going into their CVs, but they're all heavily invested through their professional and personal practice in social and emotional learning. So over there we have Luca Parry, who's the CEO and founder of an organisation called The Learning Future, and also with me a co-executive team member of Caranga. Here we have Emiliano Rodriguez, who's the co-founder and education director of a brilliant Mexican NGO called Atentamente, and Emiliano is also part of Caranga. Here we have Omar Altal, who is the education director for Mercy Corps in Iraq, and also, unsurprisingly, part of Caranga. And then next to Omar is Katie J. Scott, who is the co-executive director of a brilliant organisation called IACT. So, Luca, if we could start with you. Perhaps you could set the scene for us a bit by giving a kind of big picture opening about how you've seen social and emotional learning used at a system level and how you see it contributing to life chances for all young people.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Thank you very much, Dominic. Yeah, look, great to be here with you all. And I think this conversation is taking place as part of a bigger context, part of WISE. So really we're all bringing in all the conversations we've had to this point about what is the big picture change that we seek in education, and how might we focus at a systemic level about trying to bring that into being. I think there's a few shifts I'd just try to place. I think the first thing is, there was a time where what you knew was enough. It was about a knowledge space. We're well beyond that now. Now it's not just about what you know, it's about what you do with what you know. I think all of us would agree with that. But I think there's a third layer to that, and it's who you are as you do things with what you know. And this is the notion of character, or of ultimately what it means to be fundamentally human. And so I think some of the transformations that we need to take place are ones where we think that school is where learning happens, solely, for example. Anna, in the previous panel, taking in some of our previous learning, asked a great question. Put up your hands if you are a student at a university or at some kind of institution right now. Put up your hands. I would say 6 hands. Put up your hands if you're currently a learner. So again, this is reframing how learning happens. And I think at a systemic level, we need to be far more inclusive about what learning might actually be. Some other things from a systemic picture about SEL is that SEL is not a program. I think there is a challenge when we talk about this programmatic add-on approach. So we're going to do our academic learning. Oh, and then, by the way, you've also done your SEL for the week because we did an hour after school on Tuesday. So the idea of kind of shift from program to practice, I think, is something we need to think about. Shift from the idea of just schooling through education into learning as places where all of these key human capabilities are developed all over the world and in all different contexts as well. Not least of all because we've got quite a few different contexts on this panel today. Yeah. So if we're just talking about schools, we are missing, in my view, as a past educator and school principal, the majority of where learning happens, which is outside of the schooling context often, and is part of a broader ecosystem. And I like this language around ecosystems. How can we connect all this piece together? Of course, it's part of our work at Caranga, Dominic, so to make sure that all systems are really paying attention to this particular piece as a core consideration for the future of learning.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Emiliano, could we turn to you? You've been very involved in a really interesting program that started with a specific purpose in Mexico and then expanded into a national school-based SEL program. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. Atentamente, we started to work in 2011 with private schools, implementing and evaluating programs on social emotional learning. But our biggest impact happened when public policy take into consideration the importance of social and emotional learning. And we contributed on the design of the national curriculum that was from pre-K till high schools. And as an example, I want to talk about the project in high schools, because in high schools you have many different teachers, the math teacher, language, ethics, etc. So how could we introduce social and emotional learning into the schools? Then there was a program that was started by the UNDP together with the Ministry of Education in Mexico that it's called Constrúyete, which means build up yourself. And this program was already working on social and emotional learning skills, but it didn't have like a very structured way of introducing this into the schools. So what we did in 2016 was, first of all, to create a curriculum that was developmentally appropriate for young students, that was also important for the context that we had, and that was sequential, active, focused, and explicit on social and emotional learning. But the other aspect of this program was to focus really on the social and emotional competencies of teachers and focusing on their own well-being. So introducing social and emotional learning, as Luca said, not as something extra that you have now to do in the schools, but actually as a tool to help teachers to cope with their stress and frustration, but also to help them to improve the classroom climate and actually to change the school culture from the inside out.
That's fantastic, and I think that issue of how SEL relates to teacher well-being as much as it does to, or educator well-being, as much as it does to the kind of skills and competences we want learners to acquire is really important, and something that I think we'll revisit later in the conversation. I wondered now if we could get the first question up on the screen, please. So if you could open the apps or go into the question. We've got the Wise Spark Up Live and the code there. And so what we're going to do, this is an open question, and through your answers, we hope, we'll create a word cloud that'll appear behind us when we finish the introductions that we'll use as a springboard for some of the discussions. And the open question is, what are the, in all of your opinions, what are the most important skills and competencies for young people to develop? So it's a completely open question. What are the most important skills and competencies for young people to develop? So if you write down... the code is NRGYK. Hasn't even spoken yet, and causing trouble. So while you're putting answers into that, and thank you very much for all being engaged in that, if the word cloud behind us is blank, it'll be all on you and your responsibility. So one of the things which is really important with social and emotional learning is context, and interventions that have been designed for a specific context can't be moved lock, stock over into different environments. A lot of the early research and practice around SEL focused on mainstream K-12 practice, and we need to be really cautious about using SEL frameworks that have been developed in mainstream K-12 contexts in different contexts outside of the ones for which they've been designed. But one of the really interesting aspects of SEL as a global reform topic at the moment is the scope for new and much more equitable examples of knowledge transfer between the global north and the global south, between mainstream K-12 and education in crisis and conflict contexts, and constituencies that haven't always had opportunities to share and exchange interesting practice and insights. And some of the most exciting innovations in SEL aren't happening in the countries that are most closely associated with education innovation or topping the PISA tables. They're coming out of practice in the global south. And they're also, in different contexts, coming out of really necessary practice in areas of crisis and conflict. So Omar, I wonder if we could turn to you at this point, because Omar's Education Director for Mercy Corps in Iraq. So perhaps you could
Thank
give
you,
some opening
Dominic.
remarks. Thank you.
Just want to say it again, that it's not about what you know, but it's about what you do with what you know. I think I'll be coding you for life with this. So to start, I just want you to feel where I am. Beside all the beautiful things that it is in Iraq, we have around 40,000 children without civil documentations. And that doesn't just prevent them to access education, but it also prevents them to access basic needs. And also there is those group of of children who misses the backyard of the school where they play and meet their friends. But unfortunately, some of those schools are being occupied by militias and armed groups. Communities are being impacted by trauma, profound stress, and fear, and that resulted in the breakdown of the social system and network. I have my Iraqi friend, Ahmed. He was telling me about his neighborhood and how much he misses that pavement under the street light where he sit every night with his friends to talk about every single thing he feel and every single thing he think about. But out of displacement, this place was gone along with Ahmed's sense of belonging and sense of networking. There's a classroom in Iraq with 20 desks. 5 of them are broken. There is 40 students in that classroom from different background, different religion, and ethnic group, and that makes them, at some point, doesn't trust and feel safe between each other. And that resulted to making the classroom as an unsafe space. So that's how it looked like when you are in a conflict area. Mercy Corps, when we are going to a conflict-affected area, we just see possibilities. To make it short and simple and a little bit weird, what we do through education, psychosocial support, and social-emotional learning is every day we're empowering adolescent boys and girls to jump out of their chair with a smile on their faces, raising their hands up in the air to answer a teacher question. I will, in the discussion more, I will be talking about this raising the hand methodology and the experience that I've been through in it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Omar. So KTJ, your context is in some ways analogous to the one that Omar is working in, but also different in many ways.
Yes. So if I can get the slide up, I think I'll share the story of Gizmo to give you an idea of the context that both myself, IACT, and Omar and Mercy Corps work in. This is Gizmo. I first met her in 2008, and she was 4 years old. She's a Darfuri refugee, and she lives in a camp in eastern Chad. She still lives in that same camp in eastern Chad. When she fled the violence in Darfur, she lost 2 brothers before they fled in the village. She lost another brother on the walk across the desert from Darfur into eastern Chad from diarrhea, something that I come from the United States. Children don't die of diarrhea in our country. And then when I met her, she had a younger sister, Mary Muda. And in 2008, you'd see them playing together. And Gizmo had this smile. Mary Muda was about, I would say, probably 18 months, 20 months, so old enough to kind of walk around and smile, play back with Gizmo. And when I returned the next year, Mary Muda had passed away, and Gizmo was the last sister in her family. So in the early part of her transition from Darfur, Sudan, as a refugee into eastern Chad, she lost 4 family members, 4 siblings. She luckily still has both her parents, and now she has some older brothers still, and now she has some younger siblings. But at the root of her journey and the beginning of it is an attack on her identity. So similar, Luca, what you're saying, when we talk about why is social emotional learning important and why is it even more important in the context that Omar and I work in, the communities with whom we work, their identity has been targeted. A piece of them because of who they are, religion, ethnicity, location in their country. So social emotional learning gets back to offering them a choice. So the beginning definition that you wrote, Dominic, was really about reclaiming your choice, right? You, with all of this, with courage and curiosity and creativity, you reclaim the choice that is lost in displacement. You don't choose, nobody chooses to be a refugee, nobody chooses to walk across the desert, to lose siblings and family members. But once you're in a camp and you are able to co-create, you're seen, you're listened to, your voice is heard, and you have the opportunity to co-create programs. My organization specifically also works in early childhood education. hiring teachers from the community, training them in their own well-being practices, but then how do you engage that really important first 5 years? And then through sport, how do you do it through soccer as well? So social emotional learning is important everywhere. I have a 7-year-old, it's important for her as well, but I think it's even more important when your identity has been challenged, even more important when every day you lack choices in your life. Being able to restore that dignity, being able to uncover the empowerment that is really squashed by top-down models, gives you an opportunity and gives communities an opportunity to reclaim and rebuild a better future. And that kind of complex solution, that peace building, looking at it differently, doesn't come from being able to answer 1 + 1.
Great, thank you for that. Can we flip back to the work? Thank you very much. Kind of reflecting on particularly what the two of you were just saying, and some of the really interesting emerging applications for SEL in the kind of education as atrocity prevention space. One of the things which often comes up is the importance of empathy-based pedagogies in that context. And it's interesting to see that from the audience we've got empathy as clearly the most significant skills. In terms of the kind of cross-context relevance of SEL, in September of this year, LinkedIn ran a survey asking executives what they thought the most important leadership skill was in 2019. And empathy came out head and shoulders above the others. So it would be interesting to get, maybe we could start, KDJ, with you, get your reflections on how you develop empathy. And
yeah, people ask me this a lot, because Little Ripples, which is our early childhood education program, it cultivates opportunities for people to uncover and discover their own empathy, right? So you can't per se teach empathy as a skill, but you can offer opportunities for people to connect with people who are different from them, listening, really teaching what deep, compassionate listening means when you don't come with intention, you don't come with your own answers. I think in America, when people discuss refugees, there's a very negative connotation, and I think probably globally over the last 10 years, because there's 70 million people on the move, there has been a negative connotation with refugees. But they're people just like you and I. They have children just like many of us in this room have children. And so when IACT thinks about cultivating the opportunities to build empathy, it's about peace, helping, and sharing. 3 pillars that are woven through all of our programs. Might be early childhood, might be our football, our soccer program, our Lead with Empathy, leadership and human rights program. But I think the idea of sitting in front of somebody and listening and hearing them, universal needs is something that nonviolent communication uses at its root. And based is that all of us have needs. They won't always be met, but they'll be honored. Right? And so I think empathy is this idea of cultivating that each one of us has those unique needs, and sitting with and listening to is honoring those needs. And I think that is empathy. So if we can cultivate those opportunities, then I think there'll be an increase in empathy.
I don't know if you want to come in on that.
You put it all, but just I want to add, because being student in school and seeing the unprofessional part of your teacher and principal, that also create empathy. This is where when we developed a curricula for schools principals to do activities in the morning gathering with students. So when the students are having fun with their teachers and also with the principals, and they see the other parts, the personal parts of their teachers and school principals, this is where they feel more connected, and they feel also more, they belong more to the school, and they take them as their own role model. And this is where empathy is being created in the culture of the school.
That's so through modelled behaviour. It doesn't just have to be taught, it needs to be demonstrated as well. It's slightly, the next question for the two of you is going to be made slightly trickier by the fact that we can't get the word cloud back up. But on the other hand, it gives you free license to interpret it as you want. But one of the things that struck me with the word cloud was, there were some really interesting things there, like love, compassion, empathy, obviously, and many others. And it feels that speaks to something that came up in one of the panels yesterday on the moonshot education issue. I don't know if many of you were there as well, but this kind of issue that we're at a point in time where there is a fundamental mismatch between the inputs that we put in to education through curriculum design, through the tasks and projects that we ask students to do, and the outputs that we're actually looking for and expect. And I wondered, Luca, in all the different systems that you've worked with and the things that you've seen, where you see that tension being effectively addressed.
It's a great question, Dominic. I think I'd say a couple of things. First, that we can think about kind of development in two ways. One is development within a paradigm itself. So you think about, here are some teachers we're going to work with them, or some school principals. They're going to get better at this particular set of skills in terms of this is what success is. The second way to think about development is to actually shift between the paradigms themselves. And I think this ultimately is what we need to do in education generally. It's not enough just to say, we're going to, with what we're doing right now, we're just going to continue to do that better. We actually need to transform the way that we consider what education needs to be, not least of all in the digital age. And one of the lines I like about this, we can't have, we need first-class human beings, not second-class robots. And that brings into kind of the future of... That's a tweet. It's not. No, it's something that's kind of out there, and it's a really great point, because of course when we're talking about social and emotional skills, as you said, Dominic, these are the core human capabilities. These are the things that when we look at kind of the research about AI, and when AI will be able to outperform a human being at a narrow task, these things are well further down the horizon, for example. But as a previous English teacher, by 2028. AI will quite likely be able to outperform a high school essay being written. And so, if I give an assignment, which is a high school essay, a student can go home, press a button, and kind of have the AI produce that particular documentation. So I really think the point I'm making here is we have to really rethink the way that education occurs. And that can be really difficult to do, because these are, particularly in some places in the world, we're talking hundreds of millions of children in a particular system, and that system has an inertia. It's kind of sometimes swinging the wheel on the Titanic and nothing happens, even though we see the icebergs everywhere, right? And so, of course, the ship is moving so quickly. And so I think kind of being agile, and the idea of failure as well, which I've heard in multiple panels across this conference so far, I think are really important things to try to bring in. One other thing I'd say about empathy, this great concept is like, everyone says, I want to be resilient. I want my child, child that we teach, your own children, I want them to be resilient. Well, how do you teach resilience? It's through experience. And so we need to think about the educational experiences that we are creating, and even better, to your point, KJ, co-creating with young people themselves. And I think the idea of being an agent of change, when we have, in some parts of the world, young people taking to the streets, stepping out of formal schooling, because they are concerned about really the way that the world is heading. So I think all these things are kind of part of that larger picture that systems need to pay attention to and try to make tangible shift towards.
Great, thank you. I think in many education contexts, then teachers and teaching unions are the kind of one of the key levers of change who need to be engaged in an education reform process. And in many come from the UK, it's true across the UK and many other countries around the world, there is, I think, a very real perception that there is more and more responsibility being pushed onto teachers to try and address societal challenges. What I think is really brilliant about the way Attentamente took Constitute forward is the way in which you engaged the teaching unions and demonstrated that this was a program first and foremost to help educators with their own mental health. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Thank you. This also brings me to the topic of empathy, because a way in which you cultivate empathy is by realizing that we all have something in common, and this is our yearning for well-being. We all want to be well, and we don't want to suffer, and this is true for children, and this is true for adults, and in particular for teachers. So we use this common knowledge to look with them, what are the causes for well-being? Because historically, school has focused on achieving well-being through material means. But you know that you can have everything materially, that you can be healthy and handsome and loved and have a very successful job, but still be very frustrated, stressed, or experience greed, for example, to the point of hurting yourself or hurting others. And on the other hand, we also have examples, and examples among teachers and among probably people around you, around here, that you can have a lot of challenges materially, externally, physically, in a societal level, but still have an inner sense of ease, of connection, of purpose, and also of clarity. So teacher needs that. And when we ask teachers, for example, what are the main challenges at school, they realize that, yes, there are a lot of external challenges, but most of them come because they are stressed. They are very frustrated. But also they have challenges with teacher, with other colleagues, with parents, etc. And when we ask also, what are the qualities of a teacher that really left a very positive imprint in yourself? Maybe you can think about, what are the qualities of a very good teacher that you had? It's not something that's related only to their professional skills or their passion even about the subject, but it's their ability to relate with you as a student. And these are social and emotional competencies. So when we work in this way with teachers, we were able to break this resistance of doing something that was coming from the policy level. Because policy level, it's very powerful, but teachers feel it as something that it's imposed. So now I have to do something extra. I have to care about the emotions of students when I'm not a psychologist. But when you see that this is something related to your well-being, that's something that you share with all, then that shifts the perspective.
You coming in?
I just wanted to say it's interesting because taking it to other level in conflict affected area is that sometimes we have to work with teachers themselves because they are stressed and traumatized. Like sometimes they lost their homes, they lost their families, and then they have to go and teach. So social emotional learning also has helped us to work with teachers themselves, how to cope with their own stress and also to deal with the students' ones. So, yeah.
People are interested in learning more about that. There's a really brilliant research paper that was published by Paul Frisoli from FHI 360 and a couple of his colleagues that I think it has the slightly uninspiring title of Policy Paper number 38, but it's one of the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring policy papers, and it came out in May of this year, and it speaks exactly to the things that Omar was just talking about, and is a really valuable resource.
I just want to add one perspective to this that I think ties it all together, and that's the idea of, like, what is a system? A system is just a collection of human beings, of kind of norms, and so the idea you can't just do one thing in one part and not think that it's think that it's going to transform anything. So, be this in crisis or conflict, be this in a formal schooling structure, you need to think as an ecosystem. You need to work with educators, which, by the way, we have a well-being crisis for educators in most countries in the world. Because how can you learn social emotional skills from somebody that is not displaying them? It just doesn't fly. And so the idea of really thinking about every single member of this ecosystem, including, of course, the families, which are the first teachers, you know, and so bringing them in and trying to have this happen in multiple contexts all the time, having an ecological approach, you know, to use Stephanie's language, I think is the most powerful way to think about transformation.
I just want to add to that from the humanitarian perspective. Co-creation is like a novelty in the humanitarian sector. And it's unfortunate because when refugee is just a legal status. Like you had to cross a border and you cannot return home, and then you're in another country. And if you're displaced internally, same thing, it's just a legal structure. You have all the assets that you've brought with you. You still have everything in there. Yes, there is shock trauma. There is things that may be a current hindrance to your well-being, right? And so wellness tools will help. But I think what hinders that is when humanitarians don't think of themselves as part of an ecological system. Yeah. You know, so we, you know, I don't work in a K through 12 system, but, you know, in the humanitarian system, when Omar and I, if we go in to train teachers and I'm stressed, how can I be teaching a teacher from the community to, you know, be mindful, do breathing, if I'm not also practicing those. There's this, because SEL is having this moment in time and space and history, people will come and say, can you just review this curriculum and like drop some mindfulness into it? I'm like, oh, okay. Like, are you mindful? Do you practice? So it's like it's an ecological system. And if we really want to look at our futures and create a more purposeful, where people are purpose-filled and peaceful, where we're not constantly in either physical or emotional unsafe situations, we all have to think of ourselves as interconnected, and that collaborative and co-created system is so essential. And the way we're going to get there to think like that is starting young in the opportunities of including well-being and not making it this like add-on, right? Like Tuesday after school, I sat and I did yoga. I practiced yoga for 20 years. I deeply believe in yoga. But it has to be part of everything that you do. It has to be part of your organization. It has to be part of the principals and the administration and the teacher unions, because we can't come in and say this is something that you should do, because it'll be better for the future, right? It's definitely an ecological approach to all of the systems.
And I would like to add something else. In the case of education, what we also found is that it's very important not only to give this training and opportunities to teachers, but also to principals, and not only principals, but also the supervisors, the technical assistants, and more people in the ministry, so that you are actually changing the culture of the whole educational system. We work, for example, in regions. So in regions, we're starting with a professional training for teachers and principals, but we invite all these other layers in the community and also members of the family or the parents associations, etc. And we create a leadership group. So this leadership group can really build capacity locally and come up with a plan to implement this more in the region and in their context.
It's about, like Omar was saying, it's about modelled behaviour, isn't it? And it's from all of the people in the education ecosystem. If we could hold these thoughts for a second, and we'll get the second question up, if that's possible, which from memory is very pertinent to the conversation we've just been having. So, but also a mystery to all of you. So, the second question was, what skills and competencies are most important for you as educators? And so we'll build a word cloud, and then if we can leave the word cloud up this time, because I think we've just got one slide left for the end. So I think, reflecting on what all of you were saying, it's really interesting with the sort of issue of education as an ecosystem, and it still feels like in many contexts, social and emotional learning is presented as a choice, and you either have a knowledge-oriented curriculum or you do SEL. And this came up, I was talking to the journalist from Schools Week before this panel, and he brought it up there as being something which is still a very live debate in England, in particular in the UK, but I think it's true of many other countries. And so I wondered, it would be interesting to get your reflections as to how do you address that challenge, because as we're talking more about social and emotional learning, and there is this idea that it is quite zeitgeisty at the moment, it is being pitched as the solution to many challenges that we're looking to address. That also opens it up to many more attacks from different political or ideological positions. And one of those is that SEL is a distraction from what really needs to be happening in education, which is the creation of knowledge. So, Luke,
I'll respond to that.
And we'll come down the line with thoughts about that.
The Aspen Institute did some really good work on this in particular, and one of the insights from that is that we should start in terms of transforming systems with programs, with the idea we have to introduce something at some point. But then when we think about social, emotional, and even academic learning, they're kind of a triad. You can't do one without the other. Things like self-regulation, for example, they have social, emotional, and cognitive aspects. It's all integrated. And it kind of reminds me of what we do in schools, which say we're going to learn maths now, and now we're going to learn, history. And then but of course, you step out into the real world. The real world isn't segmented in this particular way. And so I really I think it's curious that we think that these things are even opposites. It's a false dichotomy at best. Everything is integrated, and of course that's why teaching is such a complex undertaking. Being an educator in any context, crisis and conflict in a grade 2 classroom, is because we're dealing with human development. And so these ideas of like we can just scale this particular platform or something, that's not going to do it, because this is really about identity. I think your point was beautiful, really. It's like, well, who are we in the world? And who are we becoming? And then how do we use our skills and our knowledge to actually contribute in a powerful way? I mean, that I think is the big piece here. So I think it's the same with the knowledge skills. What's more important, knowledge or skills? Like, well, you've got knowledge, knowledgeable skills or skillful knowledge. I mean, exactly, it all kind of feeds into itself. And I think often separating these things are organizational devices, they're not learning devices. So we think about the process of learning. It's nonlinear, it's kind of expansive, it's emergent, to use that kind of language, right? Sometimes you turn up at a classroom level, you don't know what's going to happen, and that's just part of being an educator. So that's kind of what I think. I think often we want to compartmentalize things. It just doesn't work when we talk about the development of a human being.
I think, to add to that, I think every human has the right to thrive, right? So this is the underpinning of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the underpinning of the Convention of Children's Rights, the, Convention on the Discrimination of Women, whichever one you want to look at. It's this idea that each of us has the right to thrive. We're not just going to survive, right? So in order to do that, it's all of these words that are being put up in the word cloud. So when we think of education, it's this idea of how can you help a person thrive? And in order to thrive, what do they need? Yes, their basic needs need to be met, right? We want shelter, we need food, we need water, but what is their purpose, right? Where is their passion lie? How can you help turn passion into action, whatever that passion might be, right? And every human being deserves that, and there's barriers to that, and those barriers can be turned into opportunities if we look close enough. So I think when we think about what we want our students to come away with, what kind of learners we want the ones who will end up thriving whatever environment they land in. So how do we support that journey, right? And it's going to be different. Each of us is going to be, because we're all different. That's human development. So it's focusing on the skills that will help individuals thrive.
Just something also around the workings of the brain. So now we know, for example, that emotions and our reasoning are very interrelated. When you see, for example, dog that is barking to you, then the area of the brain that reacts is the limbic system, like the emotional part of the brain, that is activated and said like, oh, there's danger. But then it's connected to our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain of reasoning, memory, perspective, and everything. And then I'm going to use this model that Dan Siegel uses of the brain. So the limbic system activates. It's connected to the prefrontal cortex that evaluates. And if it says, oh, don't worry, it won't hurt you because there's something that is preventing from hurting you, then the limbic system calms down. But if the prefrontal cortex says, oh, you better run because it's going to bite you, then this prefrontal cortex disconnects literally with neurotransmitters from the limbic system. And now all the control is coming from the limbic system that only knows to do three things: either attack, or freeze, or run away. So if children are in situations where they see danger constantly, it may be because of an exam, or it's maybe because they come from a very vulnerable situation, surrounded by stress and by poverty, etc., then they are in this mode, disconnected from the prefrontal cortex. So they really cannot access all these resources of memory, perspective, reasoning. And then the decisions that they will make will be really like for survivance. So if we are interested on helping children to really learn and to nurture and expand all their capacities, we have to care about this. We need to help them to regulate their own emotions, to bring again the connection between these two systems. And that is only through emotional regulation and emotional awareness and all the other social and emotional learning skills. So they're deeply interconnected.
I love the inclusion of exam in the kind of range of dangers that students might, because I think it speaks to a really important issue there around student burnout around the world and the relentless testing and the pressure. There's also this really interesting emerging research about the relationship between SEL and sort of ways of mitigating toxic stress on cognitive development at key moments of childhood and adolescence. Which is a sort of another application of it that we haven't even got to yet. And Omar, you're working in an incredibly complex and stressful environment, and it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on, how these skills and competencies that the audience are saying are crucial for them as educators relate to the practice that you see.
Whenever I introduce myself to people that my name is Omar Tal, working as head of education in Iraq, they go by, oh my God, or they look at me and they're like, but are you okay? So they always look at me as how I am surviving. But competencies and values that me, my team, and the people working in the ground, they're having is what keeps them moving forward. And for me, looking at this as the one part which is not that big on the screen is listening. Because for me, being in the field with affected youth, if I'm not listening to them, I'm not gonna know what I have to do to them. So listening for me, sitting with them and listening to their needs, and listen to what are the services that they would like to receive is what fuel me in the field.
When we were prepping for this, then you talked about a specific story of one of the educators that you worked with.
No, I wanted to. Actually, it was related to the discussions that we have. But you want me to go?
Yeah,
say?
go for it.
Cool.
It's a really interesting.
No,
story about the
it was related to the not the educator, but it was related. The story I wanted to share related to the previous discussion is that once I was, which is the raising hand part. So once I was working in the office with those boring stuff, writing a proposal and then report and all of this. So whenever I am in that situation, simply I go to the center just to look at kids laughing and playing. So I was sitting in a classroom at the back seat, and then the teacher asked question, and then literally like 25 girls jumped out of their chair, raised their hands with a smile, me, like they wanted to be picked by the teacher to answer. And then the teacher selected, choose one of them. She gave the answer, and then it was right. The students started clapping for her, and she sat down. That whole view melted my heart with passion. Like this what happened, like the standing up, the screaming, the hands are high, and like they're clapping for each other. And then when I left it, I started think of it. What if the girls were not confident enough to raise their hands in the classroom? What if they were traumatized and they don't have that self-awareness and confident to raise their hand to answer a question, right? If we go back to the story itself, if we think of raising the hand, this is where confidence and self-awareness is coming, right? If we think of when she was picked, her peers sat down respecting her, and that's positive networking value happening between the kids in the classroom. And then when she finished, when she gave the answer, she was not sure if it's right or wrong, but she had the courage to say it. And then when she finished and sat down, her peers started cheering and clapping for her. And that's wonderful societal actions that were happening is what social emotional learning, right? Education was the question and the realization of the answer. Social emotional learning is sharing the knowledge and respecting each other. Thank you.
There you go. It was always going to happen at some point.
That's why I told the story, just to get
So and you feel that a kind of key part of what you've been able to do with Mercy Corps is around the design of the safe space and the learning environment and the inputs that you've created?
Because as I mentioned at the beginning, safe space is not a center with walls and a big door and 2 guards in the front of it, right? As I mentioned with the story of Ahmed in Iraq, his safe space was literally the pavement under the streetlight. And that was my safe space too back in Jordan. I used to leave home, go sit on the pavement in my flip-flop with my cousins and talk about everything back in school, talk about like everything that I can't share with anyone else. That was my safe space. So The safe space is how I feel, where I am, and among the people around me.
There's, I think it's a really interesting area of research as well around how you can have a social and emotionally oriented learning environment. Well, Katie J, do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. We in our Little Ripples we train a lot of refugee leaders, and when we go, we train, and then we leave because the programs are run by the community members themselves. We don't leave foreign staff on the ground. And always when we're leaving, the community member, stay, we want you to stay, we don't want you to leave. And we have other NGOs, and they're like, nobody will come to our trainings. Why does everybody want to go to your trainings? What do you do? What do you do differently? And I think part of that is creating this safe space. And it's not just, it's almost a brave space, right? It's not just safe because everybody has their own version of safety and feeling that safety. But this idea that like you're socially and physically and emotionally in an area where you can be yourself. And so creating that space for your students, for your teachers who you're training, for your organizations, whatever space it is that you're working in, making sure that it's safe, and then connecting it to joy and playing and smiling. The learning will always happen if you're safe and you're playing. Even adults. When we first trained our Little Ripples teachers, they were older girls. They were 18, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and we were doing relay races. And one of the girls turned to Sarah Christine, my co-executive director, and said, I've never played. She was like 18 years old, right? She'd been a refugee at that point for probably about 10 years, coming from Darfur, living in Eastern Chad. So imagine a childhood without play, right? But if we can create the street lamp, right? If we can create that space for everybody with whom we work, for our own children, the physical safety, but the emotional safety, and then we can bring joy into it. And we need to do that also. Adults, we need to play. I find it very hard to play with my 7-year-old sometimes, but then my rational mind is like, you have to play, you have to, because we then learn. We learn more. So the ABCs and the literacy and all of that will come if we can provide that safe space and we can be with them in joy and play, and we can model that, both of those things.
We're going to turn to get some questions from all of you now, if that's okay. So we'll take questions in groups of 3, if that's all right, and give the panel a chance. So there's the lady in the second row here. I think there's people with microphones coming. Brilliant.
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much. My name is Mazha Mufti, and I work with Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And your panel is extremely relevant and even emotional to many of us. I wanted to share something that regarding what you said about social emotional learning, and I totally agree with you that this is not a program. This is kind of I would call it integrated approach that we are still lacking in, even coming from the most specialized agencies and who are responding to this crisis. So lacking the understanding that this is, as you said, it's dealing with human being, and sometimes it's one of the most complex issues in context of crisis, and it takes time. So it's not a program that has to be funded and it takes 1 or 2 months. And for that, I'll just share with you a very, very true story that happened with us. So within my NGO, we have created a choir. And because we believe in the magic of music as a healing power. We have a girl who's 6 years old, who never missed one single rehearsal. But she never smiled and she never sang for 6 months. After 6 months, she started smiling. That girl became the icon of our organization. And God knows what she had to go through for her not to miss that rehearsal, but yet not be able to sing. So these are the stories that really we deal with. But that girl, her name, ironically, her name is Ibtisam, which means in Arabic, smiling.
Oh, wow.
So Ibtisam has become one of the best learner in her school, student, well achieved. So that takes time just to really emphasize, can't emphasize enough that this takes time. It's not a program. it's an integrated approach.
Great.
So
very
thank
much
you.
for the comment. And then, so we'll take three at a time. So there was another question in the front row here.
Good afternoon. My name is Veronica. I'm a school librarian at a school here in Qatar, actually. But I used to work at a university in Afghanistan. And I wanted to ask, how important is structure and routine for individuals in areas of conflict? Because we found that structure and routine at the university for many of our students was their safe place. They knew what to expect. They knew that classes would still be in session, that the teachers would be there to help them. And we were surprised to see that they showed up every day, but they were there. So how important is structure and routine for many of the students in places of conflict?
Great question, thank you. If you'd be kind enough to pass the microphone to the chap behind you, and he can take that one. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Nick Kafka from Teach a Man to Fish. I was really glad to hear you sort of, pointing out the obvious, that you can't teach empathy or some of these skills by writing it on a blackboard and teaching it as a lesson. And also that, you need the modeling from a teacher in order, and that can happen in any subject, any time. Yeah. But it sort of feels to me like often when you're trying to shift a conventional education system on, if you can create new opportunities to practice and to teach some of these skills indirectly, that's sort of one of the best things. So, we use enterprise and setting up a school business as an opportunity. There's plenty of conflict between team members. There are problems to solve. Everyone has to take their time and take on different roles, and great social emotional learning. So I just wanted to ask you guys, what are the best examples of something like that, using something else as a platform that then creates an opportunity for this kind of learning to take place?
Brilliant, thank you, Nick. So two interesting questions and a great comment. Just to recap, the comment about working with Syrian refugees in Lebanon was around the importance of time in helping people to, I suppose, feel safe and develop trust. Then there was a question about the importance of structure and routine for individuals in context of crisis and conflict. And then next question about role-playing and using different strategies for embedding this. So, Omar.
Okay. So the comment and the question are similar. When we're talking about change need time, that means there should be routine and structure. I don't want to go to conflict-affected people. Just think of yourself when you are stressed, right? We all went through stress. When you are stressed, after a day, you don't remember what happened, right? You don't remember information that you got. You don't remember ideas because of cortisol and because of the stress existing in your brain. So, in routine and structure, alongside with time, is what make the change. Change doesn't come by now. Like, it's when I am currently working with 25 kids and doing one activity, I'm not changing them, but I'm layering the change. I put the first layer, and then tomorrow, for example, what we do responding to this, the other day, the kids, they have to come and they have to do a role play in order to talk about what they got the day before. And then we will go through the other session. So that is our routine and structure with the kids inside our centers in order for them to remind themselves, take new knowledge, and then remind themselves and take new knowledge. And that's how we layer change for the kids. So it's very important.
Great answer.
I'll just add to that. So in our Little Ripples classrooms, we train community members in a modeling way. So all of our teacher training models exactly what a Little Ripples day would look like. And that means I stand at the door and greet each person coming into the training with a handshake, you know, a kiss on the cheek, whatever the local greeting is. I say their name, they say mine, we look each other in the eyes. We start with a welcome song, getting adults to come up with a welcome song. I actually, in Greece, it wasn't picking up too much, and I did Baby Shark. It's universal. Baby Shark breaks the ice in every room. But you start, but like Little Ripples, the teacher greets the children every day, and they start with a welcome song. They sit in a circle. There's choice within that, so the teacher gets to decide what structured play activities there are, and they're given opportunities in the training to come up with those. But the reason that we model it in the training is so that it becomes something that they do every day. So after the welcome circle, they use a chime and they do a mindfulness activity. They do a breathing exercise. They're not sitting and meditating, right? It might be a really popular one is the kids get to move around as much as possible, and then when you hit the chime or the drum, they freeze, right? And so it's not teaching a child to sit and meditate, but each day it's welcome circle, mindfulness activity, small group play, could be structured play, and then it's free play. So the structure and the routine, especially if you've been through something traumatic, is essential, because that attachment, is the attachment is really important, to have a secure caregiving attachment. And then I think when you're asking about how do you teach it in different ways, I mean, our Refugees United Soccer Academy has the same pillars as our early childhood development program. It's peace, helping, and sharing. They start each soccer session with mindfulness. So you can layer it in. It just becomes part of the routine. That when you go to the Refugees United Soccer Academy, led by 2 women and 2 men, so you layer in the different aspects of equity, but they always start with it. And then because the community leads it, and because we train the community, they will have that knowledge and they can practice it wherever they want, way longer than humanitarian groups will be there, right? Humanitarian, we know what happens. An emergency happens, media spotlight, humanitarian aid goes in, grants dry up, humanitarian group leaves, displaced population stays, right? So that's why you train the local community to be involved and deepen that routine, and then they can apply it to anything. They can apply that routine to anything they do in their day.
And sport is a really interesting area for SEL development. I think it's we were talking about it, there's a World Bank study, I think, looking at refereeless soccer matches in Colombia as a way of developing social and emotional skills across student populations. So 0 resources required. I think one of the WISE research reports as well that's published here at the conference touches on some of these things. But Emiliana, sorry.
I just wanted to add that this is also relevant for almost every context. For example, in education, also it's very important to introduce these routines into the school culture, and that's how we implemented it in Mexico from preschool to middle school. So we had this curriculum where children will spend explicitly 30 minutes per week working or learning a new activity on social emotional learning, but the idea is that they could implement it into their routine. So in the greetings, but also before the exam or after the time for play or everything, you introduce these little things. And it takes time, as you mentioned also. One teacher told me how just after 3 months of being working with this, suddenly one girl started crying, and she asked, like, what happened? What's going on? And she said, like, this is the first time that I feel calm. They were doing, like, we call it the mountain pose, where they make some breathings and regulation strategies. And it took time for her to get to that point. And also the teacher told me it took time for me to be able to hold the space for this to happen.
Let's get 3 more questions and then we'll bring you in if that's right. So maybe we could go, there was a guy towards the back, please. Is there a microphone? So here, so one first there, and then we'll go here, and then we'll come to the front.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks to the panel. The points are all really relevant. Only one I'd push back against, though, would be the statement that we can't teach empathy. Because I would also argue that we haven't looked at and discussed why we teach many of the things we do teach. And if you look at literature and poetry, that's all based around walking in someone else's shoes without having to experience it. And so I would say you can teach empathy, and you can teach it via many of the things that we currently do, now, but our role, when I come from an education association in the US, is to draw out when we're actually teaching and developing empathy, and taking less of the focus on, let's say, the grammar, the sentence structure and so forth, but really looking at why we're teaching these things and raising to the fore these cases of when empathy is being shone through.
Great.
Thank you.
Very much. And then there was a question at the back there, the guy standing up. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Muntasir. I work for BRAC Education Program. I have a comment and which will lead to a question. So I think there is no debate anymore that SEL is an integral part of learning, but I think we should move toward what SEL entails, what the content is. Because in both of the questions, empathy was the largest word, but empathy, as the gentleman also mentioned, empathy teaches us to put ourselves in other shoes, which is not always possible. So maybe we can stress on compassion, like I don't understand your pain, but I still support you. But also, are we developing enough critical thinking among children to understand by empathizing, are they compounding the problem of the person they are empathizing with? So what entails this SEL curriculum and how we can develop this so that practitioners like us, when we go into a school, we can take that curriculum and teach effectively? How can we build that scientific material? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. And then the lady at the front in purple. If you could. Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm from the Philippines, and we work with a lot of public schools all over the country. And we'd like to train the teachers and community workers to administer psychological first aid during times of disasters, and conflict, well, whether it's man-made or natural. And we'd like to also get into ending violence against children, especially also during calamity times and conflict areas, and of course the mental health and all of that. Is there like a program wherein we can put all of that together and teach it all at once, or would it be all separate and different programs altogether?
Okay, thank you very much. So we have three excellent questions and comments. So one, can we teach empathy?
Yeah.
Then the sort of relevance of different SEL constructs for different contexts, and is empathy the right language, or to be compassion? To what extent, I think, is SEL culturally determined in different contexts? And then the third question about psychological first aid and rolling together a lot of different necessary interventions. I don't, Luca, you didn't speak.
Look, I'm gonna have a crack at the empathy one. I think it's a fantastic insight. I think I would start with a question, like, what is education for? It's the first question, right? And then we can ask, and what is success in that model, right? And then we say, well, how might we know that success is being created for the learners, and that includes, of course, adults as well as young people. Empathy is tricky. I suppose the nuance around empathy is that I'm slightly concerned, speaking frankly, that because this is the moment for something like SEL, that if I'm a teacher and I go, oh, I've got a good idea, and I'm going to brand it as, here's my empathy program, without any kind of empirical basis, or even which type of empathy we're talking about, be it cognitive, emotional, or motivational, which are the three different types of empathy, of course. Your point about literature is very good, of course. There's some interesting insights that when you read fiction, for example, this is, to use the Atticus Finch term, you put the skin of somebody else on, you put yourself into their shoes and you walk around in it. And that we can see empathy can be increased by those types of experiences. But I think just saying, okay, everybody, welcome to Empathy 101 is not sufficient. So, and the point I want to make about this is that we can prescribe, and we need to prescribe, because this idea that every young person, every adult, every person in the world has a right to thrive means that we need to make sure that everyone is accessing that right. But then I think we get to a ceiling after which we need to professionalize. So it's prescription, sometimes first, and of course, always context determined, but then how can we enable kind of the human resources in a school, in a learning context, in a community, to kind of be this neighborhood that can kind of take some of these learnings forward. I wanted to make a quick comment for the teacher man to fish. I think it was Nick. Project-based learning, I think. I mean, there's a reason that Larry Rosenstock is a phenomenal educator and educationalist. And the work that High Tech High does is young people doing real things with each other for a real audience. Of course, you can go a step further and say into a real market, which is the social entrepreneurship piece, which I love a lot. And so I think in every school we should be thinking about rigorous and intentional project-based learning, as opposed to sometimes what we get stuck with, which is kind of, we all know that literacy and numeracy are it's empowerment, but they are the floor, not the ceiling. And even in places like my home country of Australia, sometimes we have this back to basics approach, in a world that is transitioning faster than ever before. And I don't think that's kind of the language. So there's a couple of comments I wanted to make.
Thanks. Omar, you're going to come in.
Something just came to my mind. Do you know when there is like a couple months newborn, when you look at his face and you make your face sad, he start acting you, right? So that's for me. There's a lot of things that came within us, like empathy and being self-aware. It's all in us, but sometimes our environment impacts it. Either it improves it or it kills it. So so it's a culture that we need to raise again. And answering your question is what we have to look for is the roots that killed the culture of empathy in the community, right? The book, for example, that we did for the principals, that in Iraq community, for identity was disappeared, right? Citizenship was not there, and also we needed to focus on reconciliation, giving the community that we are working with, and also the increase well-being. So working on supporting well-being, supporting the social cohesion, and also raising up citizenship values for children. Those values and behaviors and attitudes and activity they go through, it raise up empathy and the culture again. So it's about working on the causes of the problem in order to have this culture back again.
So Emiliana, if you come in there, and then we'll get some. We're almost at time, unfortunately. So we'll get your thoughts, and then we'll get some closing thoughts on the overarching topic from the four of you.
Sure. Yeah, just for the framework that they were asking about social emotional learning, we have these competencies of self-awareness and self-regulation, and then empathy, collaboration, and social awareness come together, and then all the skills about decision making, and also we add, for example, perseverance. So this is a big framework, and these are complex competencies. But what we know from neuroscience also is that this more than learned is something that are to be nurtured or cultivated. We also know from neuroscience that there are some more basic pillars that help you to build all these other competencies. These 4 pillars is, we call it in Atentamente, the ABCs of emotional well-being. The A is for attention or awareness. So the first thing is that you have to learn to be present and calm with whatever is happening, and you can train that, and we know that from neuroscience. Then the second is the B for benevolence or big-heartedness, where empathy is included. So we also know that there are some trainings that you can start doing to amplify your awareness about what other people may need, and also what you have in common with them. And when you find that out and you train it through first your thought and through interactions, plays, and experiences, then you can actually increase this big-heartedness. Then the C is for clarity and this perspective taking and critical thinking, to take a wider perspective of the world, but also of the workings of your own mind, the histories that you tell yourself. And then the D for directions of a sense of purpose. And neuroscience have shown that all these are malleable and are actually something that you can nurture and cultivate.
Brilliant, thank you. So we'll run down the line very quickly with final thoughts on why does social and emotional learning matter.
Look, I think we're at a moment in time where we have a convergence of industry, future of work, existential risk, social cohesion, all these challenges that we all know every single day. And I think social and emotional learning can get us towards this world of thrivability in some ways. And I think moving from, well, what do you think, to how do you feel is one of the really big shifts that I think we need to nurture the emotional side as well.
Cool, thank you.
Why does social emotional learning matter? I believe that it can help break the cycles of violence that community members, so over 70 million people in the world are displaced today, but we're also stuck in our own cycles, right? Our own cycles of trauma that I've experienced and that I bring to the world, that I bring to my work. And so by being resourced and by paying attention, I can serve better the world, but it also helps people break free of what is blocking their own identities and their own purpose. So social emotional learning is what we can cultivate so that we can live a better life, so that every person has a purpose-filled and a peaceful life.
Thank you. Omar.
So the community is the womb of the community, because it's participating on creating the human race. So adding social emotional learning and focusing on the importance of social emotional learning, that will bring us back to you, which is to know what we have to do with what we already know about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Emiliana.
I think social emotional learning matters because we all want to be well. And if we really want to be well, we need to focus on the emotional dimension of well-being. And this is something that can be cultivated. So the change starts from the inside out.
Thank you. Could we go to the last slide, please? So one of the things that we've all, I think, experienced with work that we've done with educators who are looking at social and emotional learning is that it can be quite a lonely or an isolated role in a school, because very often you're the first person to be pioneering approaches. And that was one of the drivers that led us to want to establish this new global alliance around social emotional learning and life skills called Karanga. When we were trying to decide the purpose of the organization and the name that we wanted to give it, we thought it was really important to have a name that wasn't in English, that wasn't an acronym, because we wanted it to be a global alliance. And as I said before, some of the most interesting practice in SEL is coming in non-Anglophone countries. So Karanga is a Maori word, which means a call to welcome, and we're welcoming people into the movement. Karanga has 4 areas of activity. So one is around advocacy, global advocacy for SEL. One is around implementation and working with practitioners and policymakers and researchers. The third is around research and looking at how Karanga can be a conduit to a much wider range of research through translation or through giving a platform for research coming out of the Global South, or translation of research from different countries so that it's accessible in more languages. And then the fourth area is the idea of helping to build a much more connected community, so the ecosystem aspect of Karanga. And we're developing an online platform that will help educators who are interested in social and emotional learning connect with one another much more easily. So if you go onto the karanga.org website, then there's a section where you can register your interest. We would love to welcome all of you into the movement. And for me, the answer about why social and emotional learning matters was best put up by, there's a quote from Hannah Arendt, a German philosopher, who said that education is the point at which you decide if you love the world enough to take responsibility for it. And I think social and emotional learning is exactly that point for all of us. So I hope you will join me in thanking the excellent panelists and you for all of your time.